And I want now to move on to the second paper in this session and to welcome Gaile Wotherspoon, who is coming in from Saskatchewan, I think. Is that correct, Gaile?
Yes, I am.
Where are you joining us from?
Saskatchewan.
From Saskatoon, yes. Well, I grew up in Saskatoon. We'll have to have a chat about that after.
All right.
But Gaile has not spent all of her life in Saskatchewan by any means. She's lived and worked in many parts of the world. She had a spell with the Canadian Forces, Army Reserves too, but she's long had an interest in history, has a Bachelor of Education in English and History, and also an interest in post-colonial African literature. So she's a woman of wide perspectives. But genealogy, family history, and so on have been quite a long-term interest of hers too. And now in her retirement, maybe I should say so-called retirement from all of these other activities, she's taken up PhD research at the University of Strathclyde. And we're looking forward very much to hearing her speak to us today on the Shamrock and the Thistle, the impact of Irish and Scottish settlers on their communities in Saskatchewan between 1905 and 1925. We're looking forward to this very much, Gaile. On you go.
Thank you. All right. So first of all, I'd like to thank Margaret for your introduction. And I'd like to thank my two supervisors, Tanya Budelman and Tahisha McCabe, who are keeping me on track because the topic itself can become quite the rabbit hole. So first of all, I'd like to say hello from Treaty 6 territory and the traditional homeland of the Métis people. This is an important aspect to life here now and should have been recognized quite some time ago. So I would like to make that recognition. My thesis is on the Scottish and Irish in Saskatchewan. And well, let me see if I can get this to share. Oh, okay, not going to work. Oh. Now, can everybody see that? I hope so. If not, oh well.
That's right, Gaile.
It's there? Yes? No?
Yes, it's good.
Oh, good, good, good. I'm never sure about technology. I'm better than my mother was, but there's still issues. So why did I choose the Irish and Scottish in Saskatchewan during this time period? A lot of it came down to many of us having family and friends who have either Scottish and or Irish family members. And so this became a very important aspect, especially from the genealogical perspective. In addition, 1905 to 1929 was 24 years of what we could call a boom period. 1905 was when Saskatchewan and Alberta became provinces, and 1929 was pretty much the end of a boom era and moving into the Great Depression. In my search for information, I found very little that was specific on the Irish or Scottish. I don't know why. There are very few people who, I guess, thought this was an important thing. So I am now digging into this. There is much more on groups like Ukrainians and Mennonites, which is important, but the Irish and Scottish kind of got glommed into the whole concept of British rather than being Irish or Scottish. And so delving into this became very important to me. My first task was to try and track down where they were located. This is a map of Saskatchewan that gives you an idea of the vastness of the province. As you can see from the map, the bottom 3/4 are mostly populated, and the Irish and Scottish were scattered throughout this area. There had only been one attempt at a block settlement and that was before 1900 with the Hebridean crofters that were sent here, and that unfortunately failed. So mostly the Irish and Scottish came from elsewhere. Later on, more as individuals and maybe a little chain migration. So when I was trying to track down this information to find out where they would be located, I leaned heavily on Ancestry's listings for the censuses for between 1906 and 1926. And what I found was that the vast majority did not come directly from Britain, Scotland, or Ireland, but from Eastern Canada, which makes sense because Eastern Canada was settled well before we were. So how did things work out with finding land? Because that was really the driving force for getting people to come here. And so in order to figure out how to understand where a person was located, particularly for censuses and land ownership, the government set it out in blocks like this, and it lists the township, the range, the section, and the meridian that a farm or a small business within the province would be located. It did not list cities in this manner, even though they are within a township range area. The land itself, when a homesteader came, was free, but there was a $10 registration fee that had to be paid in order to cover administrative costs. Homesteaders had 3 years in which to prove up their land. By proving up, we mean that they had to have at least 2 permanent structures, one for humans and one for animals, and at least 30 acres plowed, planted, and harvested within the 3-year period. The trick was that a good 6 months or more of the year is under snow or frozen. So the time period was not really 6 months. It was definitely not a year for the homesteaders to get these things set. Unfortunately, far too many of them failed and just left. They just abandoned their land, moved off. Either they went back to Scotland or to Eastern Canada or off to British Columbia or Alberta. So the land was fluctuating between people, shall we say. In order to understand the size of a homestead, land was sold as sections or part sections, and each section of land is 640 acres. So you can well imagine that when the Scots came to Saskatchewan to farm, and all of a sudden having all this land in front of them, I'm sure it must have really caused them concern, because what are they going to do? And many, many historical records and books and articles emphasize this concept of masses of land. Between the harsh winter conditions, having to get everything done within maximum 6 months, it made it very difficult. And on top of that, migration and immigration tended to be more families, single people, not much block settlement, some chain migration. 1910 was, of course, the time of big push to get Irish and Scottish and any other British English to come to Saskatchewan to settle. Single men, families were very encouraged to come by the land, but in order to make sure that the single men stayed, they encouraged women to come either as domestics or teachers. The objective of the government was, of course, to marry them off and have them settle. In my research, I found that there are at least 6 other broad themes besides immigration that have emerged. Education, economy, politics, religion, war, and women are the 6 main topics that I am going to be exploring. I have covered sort of in a very superficial manner at this point, education. It was very important for children to be educated. And so schools could be built within a 5-kilometer radius of farms, and they could have a minimum of 5 students attending in order to have a school. The land had been set aside by the federal government in order to have place for these schools to be built, but it was very, 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 what should we say, distant. And if a school was to be built, families had to petition the government to have permission to actually build the school. This is an example of what one of the one-room schoolhouses would have looked like, because they were all one-room schoolhouses, and they had multiple grades. So you could have a grade 1 child sitting next to his older brother or sister who was in about grade 8. As time progressed, of course, there were more schools, and that meant more grades could be added and bigger schools built. But for quite a long time, this was the standard. This is the Cottonwood School. It still stands. It also gives you an idea of all the distance around a school. So children would have to come by horse, by wagon. In the winter, they would be brought in by what we would call a cutter, which is a modified sled drawn by horses. The horses would have been housed in a barn or taken back home by the parent. One-room schools did not die as things progressed over time. In fact, one-room schools were still being used up to the 1960s. So the next move, of course, once the school was built, was to get a teacher to come in. And most of the first teachers came from Britain, or like Jeanette McFarland from Manitoba, or other provinces like Ontario or Maritimes. They were boarded with local families. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. They either stayed for a year or two and left, or they married a local farm boy and set up families and had to leave teaching, of course, because you weren't allowed to teach after you were married. The buildings were obviously very poorly built, not much in the way of windows, bad lighting, lack of teaching supplies. So the challenges were many for these young teachers who were predominantly female. But the schools were not just the focus of education. They became the hub of a community. They were a place for meetings for different organizations. They were a place for socials and dances and concerts. And they were also a place where, until there was enough people to develop a church of their own, congregations to meet on Sundays for church services. By 1913, however, the demand for teachers outstripped the number that could come in through immigration. And so there were more and more teachers being trained in the province. They were done through normal schools, well, mostly one, in Saskatchewan. And these normal schools were based on Scottish and Irish teacher education programs, adapted, of course, for Saskatchewan and Canada. And in the 1913 University Yearbook, there was a notice requesting that teachers who wanted to make it happen get their license and apply to a school as soon as possible. They ran this ad for a number of years in order to encourage more and more teachers to take on these roles. So tracking families using both historical and genealogical records involved things like the homestead documents, family histories, censuses, newspapers from local communities, community history books, which are very, very useful here, the archives, of course, and museums across the province, and there are a number in each small town, and being able to communicate with them was very useful. The one thing that had helped us develop as a province was, of course, the railroad. And by the time they were done in the 1920s, there were main lines and sublines all across the province. You could take a train to pretty much anywhere. These were built not just by Irish or Scottish laborers, but many other nationalities as well. However, the Scottish were quite heavily involved. And when I was going through censuses, I came across a little notation against an Irish family that labeled them as being squatters in a boxcar. And I thought, okay, that's a little odd, but whatever. And so I contacted the local railroad museum here to see if anybody knew what one of these would look like, because I'd seen a bigger piece of information in the Floral Community History book on a family where the young couple had lived in one of these while he worked lane track for the railroad. I wanted to know what they looked like inside, because, you know, boxcars are not exactly what you would consider to be something that would be of interest to live in. And so one of the fellows found this picture from the Glenbow Museum. As we can see, it was quite homey and didn't really look like a boxcar per se. When the train would pick up these boxcars, move them down the track to the next section that needed to be laid, they were often placed on a siding. And a siding is, of course, a small piece of track that is not part of the main railroad. And this is an example of what a boxcar home on a siding would look like. In addition to that, the railroad also helped with building of towns by helping establish grain elevator locations for farmers to take their grain to be shipped out and sold. And so one of the things I'm currently looking at is the economic development of the province. In order to understand how things worked out in businesses, these small towns weren't exactly what you call huge. This is a picture of the town of Colonsay. Colonsay is southeast of Saskatchewan, and as you can see, there's not many buildings in 1915 and a lot of empty land. And that would be what they would see from their little houses or their farms or whatever they were living in. Nothing except a lot of land. In addition to Colonsay, which by the way was named after one of the islands in the Hebrides, it was interesting because there weren't that many Scots that actually lived there. It turned out it was more Irish and Galician and Ukrainian and whatever, not very many Scots. However, there was a Scotsman who built a business, a small store, near the town of Dinsmore, between Dinsmore and Wiseton. And he and his wife had emigrated from Scotland. This is in the middle of, again, a lot of land, and it served 3 separate towns. So that meant that there was a lot of trade going back and forth and a lot of people interacting at that point, not just through the school or church, but also through businesses. I have to apologize for the grainy look of the picture. It was taken in 1949 and published in the Saskatoon Star Phoenix, so it's not exactly the clearest, but it gives you some idea of what one would have looked like. As you can tell from some of these pictures, the province is not immune to the changes of climate and soil and the conditions that were created by floods and drought, infestation of insects, and the extreme winters, which decimated crops often and killed off livestock. This has and had and will probably always have a direct impact on the economy. What I did find, though, was in my search for information, I went to Facebook and I wanted to know how many people on the old Saskatchewan Facebook website had Scottish and Irish family relatives, and the response was amazing. It was huge. There was so many that were willing to share their family stories. And also by reaching out to local museums through Facebook, going through some of the community history books and newspapers for different towns, I've been able to discover a lot about this province, more than I ever knew, and its people, particularly the Scottish and Irish, who had been neglected pretty much all this time. I'm going to stop here, and if any of you have questions or comments, please feel free to let me know.
Well, thank you very, very much indeed, Gail, for that splendid account of, as you say, a rather under-researched area of Western Canadian life and history, and particularly for giving us a very good introduction to your methodologies, you know, the types of source that you were using, and to see those photographs, the people living in the boxcar, for example, and so on. And also your positive approach to Facebook and social media as being a very significant tool when properly used for researchers. Would that we had some of these means of communicating when I was starting my own look for the Tiree people who were scattered, usually in groups, but scattered right across Canada, but in the census only referred to as having come from, you know, Scotland or the Highlands of Scotland, occasionally even board on the Atlantic Ocean, that kind of thing. The document's not always good. I wanted to thank you very much for beginning with your acknowledgement of the territory from which you're reaching us today. And just to tell others who may not be familiar with this, that really this is becoming very much the expected norm, isn't it, in Canada, that there's recognition of the fact that all of us Canadians, except for the First Nations and Inuit and Métis people, are incomers in those lands. So thank you very much. Thank you very much for doing that. I remember being chastised by an elderly woman of Scottish origin in Canada when I happened to refer to the Scots as an ethnic group. And I don't know whether you've had this experience yourself, but she said the Scots are not an ethnic group. For her, ethnic groups were all the others. The Scots and the English and the Irish were in quite a different category. And I can see Joanna agreeing with that there. Now, we haven't very much time. I must stop talking myself for questions and comments, but can I reiterate that from 5 o'clock onwards, we will have a chance to do that in an informal way. There is, for Gail, though, a question here at the beginning of your talk. This is from Lynn Campbell. You mentioned that Hebridean crofters failed. Do you know why?
Yes, there were a number of issues going on. They came here, they were told they would have equipment. There was no equipment for them. They were not prepared for the land. So that was also an issue. And then the differences in not only the space, but in the type of farming that would be expected for Saskatchewan was not something that they were mentally prepared for, I don't think. And so most of them just packed up and left.
Mhm, mhm. I know there's a very poignant letter. It's included in the evidence given to the body that eventually set up the Crofters Commission in the 1880s. A letter sent back from one of those settlers to his home in the Hebrides, and he was writing in the summer, and they had arrived in the summertime, probably late spring, early summer. And he said, if the winters are as good as the summers, we'll be fine. Whoa, quite the opposite, quite the opposite. Now, there is a question for Joanna, and I wonder if I could bring her in just with you here. Before I do that, I'm going to just pose one that Linda Riddell has asked. How realistic was it for a single man to cultivate enough land in the tight time scale? Was it more likely that a family with grown-up children would succeed?
It was a challenge. Many of the men did not stay for that very reason. And that's why the government was so keen to bring on single women, because if you get the young man married, then you have a reason to stay. As I said, many of them, before the 3 years were up, packed it in and left. They couldn't manage it, because you had to not only plant your crop, but you also had to build structures. You had to get your animals set and ready for winters, and it just became almost impossible for some of them.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yes. Thanks. Thank you very much for that. If I can turn to Joanna now, there's a thank you, a heartfelt one from Brian here, and also from Helen. What parallels are there with other classic cases of heritage tourism, particularly Americans visiting Ireland or Sweden? Is Tiree special, or is it actually a representative example of many of these kinds of relationships over decades and centuries?
Yeah, it's a great question. Thanks for that, Helen. And yeah, thanks, Gail, for a wonderful talk. That was absolutely fascinating. And Maggie as well for that story about Hector when you first arrived in Tiree. Of course, just to say as well that there's a house in Balafool called Manitoba. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So which is especially interesting because it shows how emigration is kind of woven into the landscape of the island. Yes. in the present day. Yeah. But yes, to go back to Helen's question, I don't know where to begin with this question, except maybe to say that this is maybe at the heart of my research. Is it's hard to tell how representative Tiree is because the research hasn't really been done on the perspectives of people who live in these places. So I see my research as very much a starting point to answering that question, a kind of what sorts of questions might we ask in other places, but kind of anecdotally, I think that there are traces of kind of people's interest in people who have left and the histories of immigrants in all sorts of ways. I think you kind of see it in kind of folk culture in Scotland. You see it in modern songs as well as kind of older traditional songs. And I think of going into places like, the Ullapool bookshop, and they've got the passenger list of the Hector, yes. As you walk in. And there's little traces like that when you're looking for it, you do see it across Scotland. But the other thing that I just briefly like to mention is I spoke in my research in a place called Sogndal in Norway. And after I spoke, I had Norwegians coming up to me kind of saying that it really resonated with them, that people are coming back, especially Americans, kind of coming back, knocking people's doors and saying, "We're your long lost cousins." And the Norwegians that I spoke to were very, very receptive to that. They were very, very interested. So I think that if we start asking these questions, maybe we will find some surprising answers. But I'm very happy to talk about this further in the breakout session.
Well, I think we'll have to bring this session to a close because we have another one that we anticipate very much coming up, but not before I thank you both very heartily for making two impactful presentations for us just now, giving us lots to think about and to talk about after 5. Thanks again very much indeed to you both.